Welcome, everyone. On today's podcast, we have two Seedcamp team members that are absolutely killing it in the topic that we're about to discuss, open source. Thanks for joining us, Sia and Kyran.
Thanks, Carlos. Looking forward to this.
Just so that the people who are watching, listening know a little bit more about you guys, just tell us a little bit about kind of what you guys do within the investment team. We're all, part of the investment team, but it'd be great to just get a sense for how we operate and what you guys do.
Yeah, so I joined Seedcamp a bit over 6 years ago now, actually first as an intern, and then had a chance to join the investment team full-time at the end of my internship, and more recently with the launch of our fourth fund in late 2017, I also joined the partnership. I think we all are like generalist investors at Seedcamp, and obviously our time is split on like sourcing, on supporting the company's post-investment, and also with a lot of like the other stuff that keeps us busy in the internal ops of Seedcamp. But each of us also has his own areas of interest, and I've been spending a bit more time on like everything enterprise software over the past few years, and that's also what got me interested in open source.
Excellent. Kyran.
Yeah, and been at Seedcamp myself since 2016. Like Sia, also started out originally as an intern, and then obviously as we raised our fourth fund in 2017, came on full time as part of the investment team there. And so I spend a lot of my time obviously on the kind of investment side, on the sort of sourcing side, and looking at new businesses that we're considering investing in, especially at the sort of pre-seed stage. And like Sia, have had a bit of an interest in this kind of enterprise ecosystem, and we've kind of taken a look ourselves kind of at that space and been pretty interested in some of the new kind of businesses emerging there, and so worked together on some of those.
So one of the interesting things that you mentioned, Sia, is how we see things evolve, and marketplaces evolve. Seedcamp, we see enough companies in any given year that in many ways we're like the tip of the spear when it comes to new industries. And one of the interesting things that we've seen over the years has been the evolution of fintech, the evolution of AI. And as we've looked at enterprise and B2B, we've seen this new generation of open source companies. Maybe just walk us through a little bit of a very quick history lesson as to the first generation through the current generation, and kind of what attributes we're starting to see now that weren't covered in previous generations of open source.
Sure. So I think if you go back to the open source companies of the 90s, so think about companies like Red Hat or MySQL, those companies really managed to build big businesses on focusing on some like core areas of software, like the operating system or like the database. And basically most of their monetization came from the support that they were providing to like those enterprise customers they had. So it was very much a kind of like consulting approach to monetization. And then around like 2005, 2010, you started to have like more companies that were also taking an open source approach, but where they were like kind of embracing this open core business model, where large part of the offering would be open sourced, but where there would be features in their offering that would be paid features. And that was like a trend that was also led by companies like Cloudera or Hortonwork. And more recently, we've seen a lot of companies that might also use like the business models of like consulting or open core. But what has emerged as like also a very effective way to monetize open source is actually SaaS. So like offering a hosted solution to your customers. So that you have like companies like MongoDB, Elastic, and others that have been like successful at building really, really large businesses that way.
Yeah, so over that evolution, there's certain elements that have clearly been driving that. One of them is the communities of developers and the engagement and what that means. I think the open source community has always been very strong, and it's always been a great way for developers to showcase a lot of their good work. But then there's the evolution, as you mentioned, of support and sort of how to roll this out. And then there's the other element of it, which is like, what is enterprise ready, and how does open source become enterprise ready? And then with it evolving into a SaaS solution is when it started to become really enterprise ready. But if we look at it in terms of a business, what is the renewed interest behind these commercial projects and investor interest? Like, as you've been exploring this area, and as we've been making more investments in the space, what has been this sort of re-emergence in interest from the commercial point of view?
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple things. I mean, at this stage, everyone knows that software is eating the world, and kind of naturally, as software eats the world, developers get empowered within the enterprise, and therefore there's a kind of like preference for the tools that sort of developers like playing with, and kind of growing up with sort of like open source. There's a sort of like generational thing there where those people making kind of purchasing decisions are those that were educated playing with open source and tinkering with it, and are now making actually those decisions about, okay, what software do we purchase in the enterprise? So I think that there's those two aspects. Like, most businesses are becoming software businesses these days, and just that function is pretty critical. So that's one. And then the kind of empowering of the developer within the organization. And then I think the third one is, as Sia said, it's the kind of finally that alignment around business model. You're right, there was a real flourishing of open source projects in the late 90s and early 2000s. I mean, there were very few sort of standout commercial successes, and Red Hat is one that Sia points to there. But to actually get it right from a business model perspective of how you distribute a product at scale for free, but also somehow generate a profitable business. I mean, that's a puzzle that's we're only starting to see be properly solved now. And if you even look at the sort of data, I mean, I think there's in the region of 30 to 40 plus businesses that have commercial open source at the core, basically, of their offering, that are generating kind of 100 million plus revenue yearly. So yeah, there's been a real kind of paradigm shift there, and actually the pointing to that you can actually make a kind of success out of open source there.
See, anything you want to add?
Yeah, just to add to what Kyran already mentioned, I think there's just like a lot of energy right now in the open source community. I was like looking at some stats. I mean, over the past decade, you have almost an 80% growth rate year on year in the number of open source projects. And obviously, like, the number of like developers also out there is like growing really fast. And yeah, I think open source is very much like the ultimate enterprise bottom-up strategy. So companies like Slack and others have like really democratized over the past few years the kind of bottom-up approach to selling to enterprise. And that's also what got us interested in the space, is that we've done quite a few investments that take this kind of bottom-up strategy, and open source is really like a very strong model there, where you're like, as Kyran was saying before, empowering the developer as the buyer rather than the IT department. Okay,
so we've seen this pattern over the last few years. We've made a few investments, and we'll name check a few. And if I had to summarize the advantages that we've seen so far in open source, I would say, it helps break the reliance on major vendors like Oracle and Microsoft, and gives you freedom and help companies retain more control over what they're building, help cut costs. It helps expedite sales because it's a bottom-up approach through the developer relationships. And so those are all the great things that we're seeing in this current generation and some of the investments we've made. But now let's look at the challenges. Maybe walk us through the challenges that we're still seeing in this space.
I mean, as an investor, looking at open source opportunities is not easy, especially at the stage we play in, which is very early. And basically, when you're looking at those open source companies, I mean, at our stage, definitely you will not see revenue. And the truth is that even by the time they will raise their next round, you will probably not see revenue. I mean, I think if you just look, for example, at a company like Strapi that announced this week its Series A from Index Ventures, they're growing really fast. Still at this stage, they are not generating any revenue, but you need to like find other ways to demonstrate traction. And obviously the one that a lot of investors like in that space is the number of GitHub stars. And that's one way to look at it. At the stage we invest, that number will still like most likely be quite low. I mean, we have, for example, invested in a company called Melly Search over the past few months that is providing next generation search API in an open source way. And they are like already like having a few thousand GitHub stars. But to be honest, what really got us excited here was the quality of the team, their passion for the problem, and the fact that you could see from the early feedback they were getting from a very like small number of developers that they were able to get a lot of developer love there. But it's complex. It's very difficult, especially at our stage, to really assess if this is gonna potentially be an interesting project that will just stay a hobby project for like the developers, or if this is like really an area where there is a big commercial opportunity.
So I know that we're not even at the tip of the iceberg of all the challenges, and we'll go through each one of them, but I wanted to touch upon that a little bit, Sia. Do you find that at the moment, as we're looking at open source opportunities, that the credibility of the founding team within the open source community is a huge necessity almost to really stand out?
Yeah, I think it's pretty critical to really, it doesn't mean that the founders need to be really like kind of like a prominent profile in like the developer community, even if that can obviously help, but it's really trying to understand what brought that team to build the business that way, and the fact that they are very genuine about like this like open source approach. And then usually developers that take those approaches, they would like also have like tested with like their friends a bit like what they're working on, and you can see already in this like kind of early feedback if there is something special happening or not.
I think that's exactly right. When we're looking at more traditional SaaS businesses, you know, the concept that we always think about is this idea of founder market fit. Like, why is this founder uniquely empowered to go after this space? And you know, in the open source category, when we look at those businesses, I think it's probably more kind of like founder community fit. You know, why does this individual have the sort of like credibility to kind of you know, be at the center of this ecosystem and kind of cultivate that authority? And that can come in a kind of like variety of ways. As I said, you don't need to have been sort of like respected like 20-year, 10-year, 15-year sort of like industry veteran working on that space. But what you do need to be is someone who's, you know, kind of like has a kind of like strong place within that community and is, you know, kind of like respected there. And a lot of the projects, you know, that we've been backing have that kind of connection. And you know, I think you take like I mean, Sia Works probably the closest of them, but you know, a business like you know, QuestDB that we recently backed, building a open source timescale database. I mean, those guys were working on this problem sort of internally with their previous company, Blockchain, and so kind of like pushing the kind of like limits of that product there, and therefore able to kind of like command respect when it comes to that category.
I think
other challenges.
Yeah, I think, I mean, back to the point of at the stage we invest, obviously having no revenue, and even 18 months later, probably like the company still having no revenue. It's the challenge of how can you assess as an investor that there will be a clear business ROI at some point. And that's like something that we, to be honest, sometimes still like struggle with, but in each businesses we've backed, we took a different route to try to assess that, like speak sometimes to even some of the potential buyers of such solutions in our portfolio, speak with other developers, look at potential parallels between what the company that is building this in an open source way would have with like let's say closed source competitor. So that sometimes can also help us, because that can be a good proof point that there is clearly a market for that type of solution, and that if you build a product of the same quality with an open source approach, you could potentially get tons of developer love for that offering. But I think some of the other
talking about developer love, how do you maintain that developer love? You know, like it's sometimes we see stuff so early and you know there's just promise, but you know for some of these projects to work long term, there needs to be a continued engagement. And then on top of that, how do you also do that while at the same time focusing on getting the marketing of talking to enterprises to trust you?
Yeah, and that's definitely a big challenge. This whole like challenge of basically sustaining your community, and on one hand, you know, getting the credibility there and reassuring the community that the open source software you've built is gonna still be there, and that as a project you will like keep maintaining it for the long run, and that it's not just something you published on GitHub and that 6 months later will not be maintained, etc. So that's one thing that is important to like really kind of communicate clearly to the community. On the other hand, if you are like also VC backed, or if you start to speak about monetization, it can also scare the community of developers in the sense that they might think that the open source core of the project might like in the longer term like become something that you make them pay for, so it could potentially cannibalize a bit your community. So there are a lot of challenges there that you need to balance, and at that very early stage we try to see if like the founders have already like kind of like some smart ideas around how to just basically market their project to the community, if they've been good on like writing content, on engaging with the community through GitHub, through Slack, etc.
What do you think about the traditional sales process? How's that affected?
I think the advantage of open source companies is that they don't need to have as much of like a sales organization as like more traditional closed source businesses, in the sense that as we mentioned before, you have this very much like a bottom-up adoption, and that means that at the point like the software that you're building in the enterprise has been somehow infected by open source, that's probably a pretty easy sales pitch for like the open source company to go to that organization and say, look, you already have a lot of our code that is being used by your developers, and basically it would now make sense to pay for like those features or potentially for a hosted version of like the solution. So what we see is that when like open source companies are able to really push on like the monetization strategy, usually they are able to do so with very like small field sales team and much faster sales cycle than their closed source counterparts.
Yeah, so basically in a post-COVID world, or in a during COVID world, it almost makes more economic sense to be in open source, because you in effect have almost an organic sales process bubbling up, people trying to cut costs and having projects surface within organizations as a way of replacing paid licenses. And then ultimately, once there's enough installs, then it's an easier switch into some sort of commercial model. Okay, well, look, there's clearly, we could go through many more challenges in greater depth. I mean, one topic we haven't even talked about is like security, and how do you audit that, you know? But a lot of tools, as you mentioned, Sia, are basically built into the company in ways that incrementally get more responsibility. And so as a consequence, how companies secure their code has evolved as well. So maybe moving away from challenges and into opportunities. Kyran, what areas do you think we will see open source projects, or like if you had to take a gambling bet, which is kind of in some ways what you know venture is, if you had to take a bet of what will pop up in this new generation of open source, in areas that hasn't yet been touched in the last 2 years, what do you think it will be?
It's an interesting question. I think, wish wish we could have the easy answer and sort of like preemptively map that out and make some bets in that space. But I think if you know, clearly if you look at the past sort of even 15, 20 years and where the bulk of the tools have been built, it's definitely more on the kind of you know, infrastructure side. It's tools that, you know, are pretty kind of mission critical to the kind of like enterprise and you know, in that sense, that's where we've kind of seen the bulk of the evolution in tools recently. So, you know, whether that be sort of like search and Sia, for example, mentioned, I think like Elastic there as an example. So I think that there is still I actually think that there's probably still a lot of major kind of like enterprise offerings that, you know, haven't really been much improved since the early 2000s, you know, lines of businesses of a kind of like IBM and SAP, etc. I think, you know, actually there's still a decent way to go actually in even kind of open source projects, taking those business lines and kind of like then, you know, having this open source approach and sort of like doing it from that angle. So I think we actually still have a long way to go in the kind of like infrastructure side of things, and that's definitely something that, you know, we're still paying attention to here.
Yeah, I think to add to Kyran's point, I mean, developers are very creative in just like making their own line of work also always like more efficient, and we think there's still like tons of opportunities in just you know, anything from like building, running, monitoring, machine learning, building like better environments for data science. So we actually made an investment in that space with our investment in Orchest, which is kind of a IDE for data science teams. Also in terms of like managing your APIs, potentially also thinking about new trends like robotic process automation. There's a lot that can be done there in terms of just providing better tooling for all those areas. So that's also what we are very excited about.
Yeah, and you know, as we go through that, I mentioned security a little earlier. Maybe one of you wants to talk about one of our recent investments in this space in more detail, because it's a kind of an interesting way of leveraging the community. So I know that we've covered it before, but, you know, Kyran, you want to talk a little bit more about how for certain projects that are out there that need more help, that closed source can't solve, how they're leveraging the community?
Yeah, absolutely. So the business Carlos is referring to there is a company called 418sec, who we're pretty excited to back earlier this year. And what those guys are doing is essentially, you know, as open source code gets like rapidly adopted within the enterprise, you know, there's obviously a whole host of security risks associated with that. So, you know, what they're building is basically, you know, a crowdsourced repository of fixes for you know, open source vulnerabilities. And yeah, you're right. I think what was really exciting when we first met 418sec was, you know, despite being such an early business, actually the stuff they were doing on the community side was really exciting. I mean, quite a kind of quite a radical thing that, you know, actually they were able to get people from all across the world, incentivize developers and hackers all over to, you know, contribute fixes to these open source bugs. And the way that they were kind of doing that was through almost gamifying the experience through this like leaderboard type product. And actually, I think that was, you know, of the sort of like open source businesses, like something really exciting we saw on the community side, that actually, you know, weekly they were having a bunch of people kind of like you know, contribute to this. And I think that really pointed to something that they had got right with that community management aspect.
And that's probably the most exciting thing about, you know, some of the stuff that you're seeing now is the ability to leverage that larger community, which is a very active, community in ways that previously wasn't even possible or even trusted prior to today. So to wrap things up, I just wanted to do a quick sort of review. Oh, something just fell in my kitchen. I don't know if you guys heard that. If we go through a lot of things that we covered today, which was around, you know, the evolution of open source. We covered what are the advantages of open source, how that's changed over the years, what are the challenges, and some of the benefits that we have in open source during these times. I think what I wanted to wrap things up with, Sia, is advice for founders who are, you know, listening to this or who are already in the middle of building an open source project, with how to engage with investors, how to, you know, what to have ready, what to accentuate, what to have as far as traction, so that they can engage with us or any other investor.
Yeah, I think it's a great time for open source businesses to actually think about fundraising. Obviously, like given like the whole lockdown situation, I mean, open source companies are the kind of ultimate distributed organizations. So they are usually really like good at dealing with such a situation. And I think there's also quite a lot of appetite from enterprises and from investors for like open source projects right now. I think in terms of advice, to just like cover a few of the things that we had mentioned before and maybe add a bit to it, I think this really like focus on engaging with your early community is absolutely critical. I would say don't think about monetization too early, about like just like trying to push revenue when you haven't had yet like that kind of fit with like the community. And at the same time, when you're pitching investor, still have some assumptions on why there is a clear business ROI longer term, because they will want to make sure that indeed there is like 2, 3, 5 years down the line, the opportunity to build a really big business there. And then I would also recommend transparency in general. I think you are like basically engaging with a lot of like different parties when you're building an open source business. So you have your contributors, you have your users that might not always be like the ones that would contribute to the project. You have potentially like the business buyer in the organization, and you need to manage like the marketing to those different parties. You need to also manage your product roadmap that might sometimes be at conflict between like requested that you get from different groups. So I think if you're transparent in the way you're like kind of like planning on all those fronts, and really like maybe even like publishing to the community your roadmap, etc., that will help just build that early credibility and really get like the developer love that you need to make your open source project successful. And then finally, obviously, please, if you're looking for funding, think of Seedcamp. We are active in the space. We are definitely just very keen to engage with more companies that are building around open source software. And so you can go on our website. There is a form there, submit your details, and you will get an answer from us really quickly.
So with that, thanks for the time, Sia and Kyran. You know, we really enjoy chatting with you guys, and as well as, you know, covering these topics, which I think in some cases, it's funny, as I started off the podcast, we were talking about how some of these things bubble up, and you just see momentum. And so it's great to see, you know, when you look back as a retrospective, how much momentum has been built and how much exciting ground there is to cover in this space. So with that, guys, thank you. Until next time.